Welcome to Sustainability Bridges, a Eurosif podcast aimed at building bridges between policymakers, investors, academics, and civil society around the theme of sustainable investing. Eurosif is the leading pan-European association promoting sustainable finance and sustainable investing at the European level. In this podcast, the Executive Director of Eurosif will invite distinguished guests for a 30-minute conversation on current events shaping the sustainable investing community.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Victor van Hoorn and I'm the Executive Director of Eurosif. For this episode, I'm delighted and honored to be joined by Florian Heeb, who's a researcher in the Center for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth at the University of Zurich. Together, we will be focusing today on the notion of investor impact and how investors can integrate these notions of impact in their decision-making. So maybe Florian, first of all, thanks a lot for joining us this morning. It's a pleasure to have you. Maybe let's get straight in. In 2020, you wrote a number of papers and guides around the notion of investor impact. And in a blog post you wrote, you had this provocative statement. The UN estimated in 2020 that we had 2.5 trillion investment gap per year until 2030 to meet the sustainable development goals. And you put that in comparison to the fact that we're seeing nearly on average $4 trillion or euros moving into sustainable ESG, SRI investment strategies. Many could believe that we have no problem, that the funding gap is not there. We've solved all the problems. But yet we see recently, the latest IPCC report is very clear that we're not close even, unfortunately, to meeting the targets set in 2015 in Paris. So maybe the first question is, how can we explain that gap? What is, in your view, the main discrepancy between those two?
Maybe first, thanks, Victor, for inviting me and looking forward to this discussion. Yeah, I mean, these numbers are really interesting, I think. So first of all, they share a very positive notion on sustainable investing that the volumes are really growing. So where 5-10 years ago, it has been a more niche market, we see an incredible demand from investors across all types of investors to invest sustainably. And this reflects in these huge volumes. We have something like 35 trillion US dollars in sustainable investments. But then we have these looming challenges, these grand challenges, and let's stay with climate change and the recent IPCC report. So we're really not on track to solve this challenge, despite all this funding we have for sustainable investments. And I think here it's really important to look at what do we actually need in terms of investments. And that's why I like this bit old right now figure of 2.5 trillion, the SDG funding gap. And if you drill a bit deeper into this report by the UN on what's actually needed, you will see a lot of the needed finance, needed investments are direct foreign investments into risky infrastructure projects. If you look at climate change, we know what needs to be done. The question is just how we get it done. We need a lot of renewable energy investments, and a lot of these investments need to be done in places where financial markets are less mature, where political risks are higher. So we need wind power and solar power in Southeast Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. In many places, we need to phase out coal in most of the emerging economics where they still play an important role. I mean, if these would be profitable investments, it would be no problem if they just would correspond to the risk-return profiles we expect. There is a huge need for investments that really make a change on how large parts of our world economies are developing. And the challenge is to match this demand for these investments that really help us to fight climate change with this incredible demand for sustainable investing we see in the recent years. There, I think it's really helpful to match these numbers. So in terms of volumes, we're there. But in terms of the type of investments, we're not there yet. And I think there it really helps to start about talking about investor impact. So what's the impact of all these assets we have in sustainable investment, of all these volumes we have in sustainable investing? How can they change the world? How do they change the world? And does this really match with what investors expect?
Thank you. 。
So if I summarize it briefly, it sounds like we're facing a funding or investment gap in largely infrastructure investments, which tend to be probably less liquid or in private markets. Whereas I think it's fair to say the 4 trillion we've seen is moving rapidly into liquid markets of public listed equities or bonds. Is that also your view? Are there additional bottleneck factors in your view that play a major role here?
I think that's certainly one of the key points. I mean, I mentioned this infrastructure, risky asset, where we also need other things. We need innovation. I think there's a lot of potential for startups, for venture capital, for green venture capital. But as you rightly mentioned, if you look at the current volumes of sustainable investing, it's mainly investments into large established companies in mature financial markets. There is certainly a mismatch. But also on the other hand, that's, I mean, how most portfolios look like. So if you look at the average investor, average pension fund, a lot of assets need to stay in these asset classes. Just in order to, I mean, we have fiduciary duty just on the financial part. We have a certain limits to risky investments like startups or then even foreign infrastructure investments. So it's also a huge question how to leverage this huge chunk of investments into liquid products, into large companies for change. There's also a lot of potential in taking the liquid part of sustainable investing, looking at it and asking the question, is this liquid part really as impactful as it could be if we take, for example, the objective of solving climate change?
Okay, no, thanks for that. You in your you've already briefly touched on the question on the notion of investor impact, and I know you've you and your colleagues published a number of guides looking at that, at the notion of investor impact. But I think it may be helpful here for our audience this morning if you can briefly explain what you mean by that, and particularly in contrast to what I think you refer to as company impact.
Hmm. Sure. I think there's usually there's three concepts that I like to mention in order to have a good discussion on how to make sustainable investing impactful. First of all, what is impact? Impact is, we define impact, and I think pretty much everybody else defines impact as the change that caused by a certain activity. So you do something, something happens, and your impact is always what you cause. So what you need to think about what would have happened anyhow, then you check what has happened, and your impact is the delta. So you always need a counterfactual, some people call it additionality. What did you change beyond what would have happened anyhow? And in many areas of our life, that's pretty straightforward. If I replace my fossil fuel driven car by electric car, I burn less petrol, I have less CO2 emissions. So it's pretty clear. In financial markets, it's less clear because everything you do is somehow mediated by relatively efficient financial markets. It's not directly, you don't steer companies, you just invest in companies. So you always need to ask yourself, how is my action connected? How does it change? What would have happened anyhow? And here it really helps to distinguish between company impact and investor impact. So company impact we define as all the effects a given company has on the real world, on a given parameter of interest. Let's stay with climate change and take CO2 emissions, but you could take pretty much every other indicator like gender equality or biodiversity or whatever you want to change or where you want to make a contribution. But that's company impact, what companies do or cause with their operations, with their products and services, the contribution they make to a better world. Or if you turn it negatively, the damages they do to certain public goods, also part of company impact. But then I think a very important notion is that the impact of the companies you own as an investor is not your investor impact. And investor impact we define as the change of company impact that you as an investor cause. So we're back at this initial definition that you always need to cause something beyond what would happen anyhow. So you need to think about how can you as an investor influence what companies are doing. Can you help companies to do more good or to have less negative impacts? And here it comes to the third concept we often work with. If it really helps to differentiate between two fundamentally different types of investor impact. So ways how investors can influence companies. First of all, growing green companies. I say green, take pretty much every sustainability indicator, but let's stay with green and brown for the sake of simplicity. So growing green companies, meaning you take capital allocated to companies that are making a positive contribution to, for example, climate change, and help them to grow. But then you need to think about under which conditions does my capital allocation really trigger growth. We have some indications from evidence from research showing that this is rather unlikely for large established companies that already have access to super efficient markets.
That's probably something you'd expect more in the realm of venture capital or innovation funds or potential private equity.
Yeah. Or infrastructure funding, or I mean, if you move then to emerging markets, to immature markets, if you want to trigger growth, you always need to go to places where there is inefficiencies, where there's frictions, intransparencies, immaturities, or any kind of hurdles that keep financial markets from working efficiently. Because if they would work perfectly efficient, I mean, all good projects that are profitable would get the funding they need, which is, yeah, basically what to some extent we can expect for large established companies. But then there is the second mechanism, which is improving brown companies, so triggering change, and that can also be done at the liquid parts of portfolios at large established companies. And then we're more talking about shareholder engagement, voting, potentially conduct-based screening, providing incentives for companies to improve. So all the ways investors can take even large companies and nudge them to become greener, so to say, not affecting the growth trajectories, but rather their green quality. So how strongly they provide positive benefits or negative benefits to the planet.
Okay, maybe maybe dwelling on what you said about greening brown companies, that it seems many industry professionals would agree that this is mostly done via shareholder action and engagement to nudge companies to change. We're going to get there later on about more specifically about the report Eurosif did last year, focusing on this notion as well. But I think I do want to pick out something there, which was the question. Well, is there a point where shareholder engagement has its limits, and where actually, for certain industries to change, you need to change the whole policy making framework or incentives framework around particular industries or particular innovations? Would you say that there's also potentially a role for investors to get more active on public policy engagement with policymakers? I think that's something the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance recently alluded to in one of its publications.
Certainly, yeah. And if you look at the potential of, for example, shareholder engagement, I think there's a lot of potential to improve greening the economy, but we need to be realistic. If you look at the evidence, we only see evidence for incremental improvements. Companies have a certain freedom to maneuver in the free economy, and kind of, so every CEO has a certain range of possible strategies, which I call it the space of uncertainty, where it's unclear which is the most profitable strategy, which mostly serves their shareholders. Every CEO has freedom within that freedom on this uncertainty. Companies can choose more sustainable and less sustainable pathways. Investors can nudge them towards the more sustainable pathways by giving clear signals that they prefer the more sustainable options a CEO may have in terms of strategy and operations and so on. So here, I think that there's a lot of low-hanging fruits. There's a lot of potentials for company to improve their processes without having huge costs or fundamental changes in their business models. But if you really fundamentally want to transform the economy, it's about how this space of potential profitable strategies look like, and here regulation has a huge influence. Here we're talking about, especially, are externalities priced fairly? We need to change. If we fundamentally want to transform the way the economy is going, shareholder engagement clearly won't be enough. We need to change the game, the rules of the game. And here, I think shareholders and investors could play a way more prominent role. I think that it's, as you mentioned, it's really encouraging that we see initiatives going into this direction. But I think if you look at most investors out there are large, often passively with large investors with diversified passive portfolios or even active, but they do not have per se an incentive to push certain industries with particular interests, as for example the coal industry. When these or other industries with strong lobbies to promote that, they have an incentive to generate returns on the long run for the entire economy. And we know since a long time that we only can solve this tragedy of the commons problems, these common pool problems like climate change, with clear rules of the game. So I think many investors would benefit a lot if they would push way more, for example, to incorporate externalities, to have fair carbon pricing, to change rules of the economy in a way that really enables the economy to go on a green trajectory.
No, it's interesting. It's interesting what you say, because that's at least one of the paradoxes which I find in discussions we're having, is that on the one hand, I think in many countries and European or beyond, the public discourse in politics is that the transition is expensive, that it's going to cost us a lot of money. Yet when you talk in investment circles, there's a lot of investors that would love to invest more sustainably, but they see a lack of projects or a lack of investable opportunities. So it's interesting to see that mismatch. That sound there is not there's a lack of money, but actually we need the right incentives to put that money to work. Obviously, we know that I think since 2017, 2018, the EU took this major leap forward with its sustainable finance action plan, which clearly the stated objective was one, reduce greenwashing, but two, also kind of reorient capital to the right investments. As you just said, we will have to address this notion of investor impact in achieving that, or at least get the right paradigm of thinking in the institutions. I think where we see sustainable finance, a lot has been done. It has triggered a lot of discussions, a lot of new awareness of more sophisticated approach to investing. But it seems that we haven't yet got the dial exactly right around this investor impact. So do you agree with that assertion? Do you see things that be done differently, or where kind of regulation could push us to this extra nudge in that direction?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, I'm really happy to see that there is so much political momentum on this topic. So, I mean, the whole entire EU regulation on sustainable finance, it has been a huge effort and a unique effort to push that field forward. But I think the great challenge is that's what we discussed before. I mean, it's immensely complex how investments can turn into real world impact. And I agree with the statement you made before. I think the notion of investor impact is not, in my view, sufficiently reflected in the policy frameworks we have. So let's take the SFDR as it is. The SFDR doesn't have the notion of causal impact uh, written down in regulation. And I think that the basic core problem is how SFDR defines sustainable investing. So SFDR defines sustainable investments as investments in economic activities that contribute to solving our challenges we have. So there is a contribute, but only on the level of economic activities. So that's what I would call company impact. So, so the SFDR defines sustainable investments purely on company impact. It doesn't have a contribute on the level of that an investment actually has to contribute to this outcome. It only has to invest into companies that contribute. And as I mentioned before, in some cases that's perfect. I mean, there's if you can assume that investing in activity will boost it automatically, that's fine. And as mentioned before, we have good evidence that this can work for SMEs, that this can work for startups, or in financial markets that are less mature. The challenge we have is that SFDR mainly covers large products that invest mainly in large established companies in mature financial markets, where you cannot take this investor impact for granted, that by just investing into green activities that you will actually boost these activities. And I think that's an aspect regulators still have to work on, and at this where the SFDR and the impact of the entire regulation could gain a lot if this investor impact um, would be kind of have more prominent in the regulation. And it could be easy. I mean, just together with my colleague Harald Valkati, we made the argument by just changing the sentence sustainable investing are investments in economic activities that contribute to societal activity. Change it to sustainable investments are investments enabling economic activities. Or cut the economic activities completely. Say sustainable investments are investments that contribute to solving global challenges or societal challenges. So I think there lays a lot of potential to improve the impact of the entire framework with some small measures.
No, that's very interesting, and I think I know through your work you're in contact with different types of investors, from the more liquid market to maybe the private market. It's indeed a comment that is sometimes raised, is that a regulation such as the SFDR is a framework at the end of the day very suited to publicly listed large equities, but maybe not a framework entirely suited to other asset classes or types of markets. Is that something you recognize as a
Yes, I mean I would agree that the way regulation is written, it's more for, I would say, products invest in large green companies. But for me, the question then is how do the products that are then labeled as Article 6, 8, and 9, how do they match to investors' expectations on what they will actually get? And I think that's, for me, the other very important part in this entire regulatory framework is investors' objectives and expectations. So I think the other puzzle piece in the puzzle in the framework is the MiFID, and especially the amendment of MiFID that's due to come in force this summer. And I think so. The idea, I think, it was always that the MiFID.
just for our audiences, the amendments that allow clients to express their sustainability preferences in some products.
Yeah, and I think that the topic, but also there, I think, it's hugely laudable that sustainability preferences are becoming a mandatory part of what advisors talk about with investors. But also there, I think it's very important to ensure that kind of we match investors' expectation, what or objectives, why they want to invest sustainably with the products they associate. And I think it's fair enough to say that we have now enough research to understand to some extent what investors expect from sustainable investments. I think it's three different things. It's performance, value, alignment, and impact. So some investors want to improve performance by considering ESG risks. Some want to reflect their values, for example, not wanting to invest in weapons, tobacco, or increasingly also fossil fuel, just not wanting to be associated with something that doesn't match with personal values. But what we see from a lot of research we do, but others do, for example, the University of Maastricht or Two Degrees Investing Initiative, that impact seems to be the dominant or become the dominant motivation why investors invest sustainably. So they want to make a contribution. And my challenge now with the framework is that this contribution, that's clearly investor impact. It's not as such recognized or explicitly recognized in the SFDR, and it's also not as such recognized in the proposed MiFID II amendments. So what I would wish for that every investor is getting asked a simple question: do you want to contribute to solving societal problems with your investment, and which problems you want to contribute to solve? That's currently, as the MiFID II is not formulated, the proposed amendment, that's not in. The investor has to get asked whether they want Article 8, 9, or taxonomy alignment, and primary negative adverse impact. But I think we need some more simple questions. We need to drill on what do investors actually want. And all kinds of retail investors, but also potentially pension fund beneficiaries should get asked these questions. Then there needs to be a mechanism to ensure that once a client states an objective that actually is reflected by products. But I think that's the direction we need to move. So creating a market that competes for investor impact.
But I think that's an interesting point you raise, because if we stick to that point and follow the logical reasoning a little bit, I think one of the main challenges I think we see is that of course, for many, I think, retail investors, there will always be, the need to have some adequate performance, products that are diversified and liquid. That's often the expectations from regulators for, legitimate investor protection concerns. But equally, there is this notion that a lot of people want to have this impact when they kind of invest sustainably, which at this stage seems easier to demonstrate in certain asset classes, which are not always suitable for, I would say, retail investors. So my question is, isn't the biggest challenge, in a way that we need to solve, is how do we start assessing or looking at how those products that satisfy those liquidity and risk diversion requirements, what kind of impact they can claim or not, but kind of managing those expectations, I would say.
Yeah, certainly. That's a huge challenge, kind of, to how to assess the impact of existing products. But I think an equally large challenge is how to talk with clients about impact. And I think advisors have a huge role to play in this entire thing. So what I think what should happen is that if an investor goes to his asset manager, to his bank, advisors should lead a qualified and a good conversation on different objectives. And as you mentioned, most retail investors, they will need a lot of certainty, a low level of risk, high level of liquidity. But that's not their only goal. So they may also want to have impact or value alignment. So it's important to have a discussions to how do personal values look like. And on this direction, we often see kind of a certain set of values being imposed on investors. So I think we need way more individualization here, and personalized ETFs, for example, are a great option to do so. But then also a discussion around, I mean, do you want to have impact, and how could that look like? And what are your financial targets, and finding the sweet spot in there. So and helping investors to find exactly the types of investments that match all these three components. For example, if you take a retail investor, we cannot, no advisor that's sane should recommend everything to be invested in risky infrastructure in an emerging market or developing country. But it may satisfy some of the demands of an investor. So, for example, an advisor could advise to take a small part of the portfolio, use it for more risky investment with a high potential to generate tangible impact, for example, of climate change, but then make sure that a sufficiently large portfolio goes into relatively cheap, liquid, and stable products that fulfill the financial needs, but also reflect some moral beliefs that can be achieved without sacrificing a lot of return or risk trade-offs on these grounds. I think that's where we should aim to have connect what investors want, but especially with retails, not in necessarily in detail understand to full extent how it all works. That's why we have consumer protection, why we have all this regulation to provide frameworks how advisors can talk with their clients, provide them with the optimal investment portfolio, fulfilling all the objective an investor has, really on a common sense level and not on a too technical level of what investors want.
So, Florian, I'm hearing a call to industry to pick up the mantle of innovation and design kind of new products. Is that right?
Certainly. I think my wish is the twofold, kind of have really think about how to structure conversations with clients on figuring out what their objectives are beyond risk and return. And I think it's good that MIFID, for example, takes up this issue, but if it's not enough in the way MIFID is written, it won't lead to satisfying conversation really solving that issue. And then innovation, certainly on how to come up with products that actually satisfy these demands. I think that's my belief. If you really take investors objectives seriously, we have a huge demand for products that really create tangible impact in the world and really make a substantial contribution way beyond what the industry realizes right now and delivers right now. And I think it's also huge business potential. So to come up with all kind of innovative products, why shouldn't retail investors, for example, not play a more important role into blended finance? I mean, we need a lot of private capital that flows into all these grand challenges, but then we need to be able to match it into good portfolios, into good products that also fulfill other objectives and, on risk return.
Maybe quick question. You mentioned blended finance, and indeed, kind of targeting. I think blended finance is usually deployed in the in infrastructure sector. Or at least there's an opportunity there to deploy it in the infrastructure sector. Which to make the circle round at the beginning of the podcast, we identified that as one of the major issues that we needed to tackle. Wouldn't pension money with long-term cycle be an ideal kind of source of funding for those vehicles?
Certainly, yeah. I think also there is a lot of potential, but then I think there we need to have a good discussion about fiduciary duty. How should pension funds take into consideration other objectives as just providing as good pensions as possible? Should they also care about how the world looks like, where the beneficiaries will live in 30, 40 years, or even their children? And I think there, again, a simple solution is, first of all, ask beneficiaries on their objectives and then base portfolios based on a broader set of objectives. And so, as you mentioned, I mean, that's about the benefit of pension funds. They have this long time horizon. They're really qualified institutional investors, so they could play a much stronger role once they realize this demand and take it seriously for impact, to provide capital to vehicles that are maybe more complex, like blended finance vehicles, but really push the scale of change we need, for example, in infrastructure in emerging markets, together with state actors. That's the beauty of blended finance, that it combines public money and private monies in ways where every part gets what they actually need, and the world gets as much outcome as we need. But I think there mainly translation work is necessary, bringing these two worlds together and then creating products that are attractive and sellable beyond some very specific types of investors, as you mentioned, to pension funds and more broad set of investors.
Well, thank you, Florian. That's very inspirational words to finish off our podcast today. And thanks for bearing with me. I took you on a slightly different path than we had agreed before, but it was I think it led to a great conversation. It's been a pleasure having you, and it's been a pleasure also seeing all the research that you guys are producing. And we will definitely hope to invite you and your colleagues back on the future episodes to see what new insights you can share with us.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Victor. It was a pleasure discussing. Looking forward to this podcast and all the future episodes.
It brings us to the end of this insightful conversation and the end of today's episode. Thank you very much for listening. Do not hesitate to like, follow and share this episode of Sustainability Bridges. Eurosif will continue in the next episode to bridge the gap between the policymaking and the practice of sustainable investing with the help of distinguished guests. In the meantime, please visit our website and follow us on social media to stay tuned. See you next time for a new episode of Sustainability Bridges.